Ca să funcționeze, societățile au nevoie de soluții pe termen lung, iar politicienii oferă mai degrabă rezolvări pe termen scurt și foarte scurt. Lipsa de viziune a liderilor a făcut să crească mult gradul de neîncredere al cetățenilor în tot ce înseamnă politică. Actualul context internațional ne arată că viitorul poate fi bun doar dacă vom avea politici coerente și bine țintite. Fără răspunsuri clare la probleme presante, actualele structuri politice pot fi afectate, chiar dacă nimeni nu știe încă ce să pună în loc. Discutăm despre direcțiile relațiilor externe cu Velina Tchakarova, directorul Institutului de Politici Europene și de Securitate din Austria. Sunt Cristina Cileacu, începe Pașaport diplomatic. Velina Tchakarova, Director, Austria Institute for European and Security Policy. Welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for this invitation.
Well, winter is coming, to quote a very famous TV series, and Europe is bracing for the impact of the energy crisis. The question is the unity going to be as powerful when people, the citizens, will have to deal with the decreasing of the standard living?
To answer this question, we need to address two important layers. First layer is the energy crisis. Now, the energy crisis was already ongoing before the full-scale war was launched by Russia against Ukraine, and it is a structural crisis because of the pandemic, and also because we are now speeding up the process of decarbonization, which of course will need time. So, on the one side, now we have the amplified effects, because war is always inflationary. And of course, one thing is clear, we need to remain on the same page when it comes to our comprehensive decision to move towards renewable energy. And that, of course, means also cutting off Russian energy supply. We've already managed to agree on 90% of Russian oil. We have agreed on 2/3 of Russian gas. Coal is already out of the equation, and I think that right now, with the upcoming winter, it's going to be very important for politicians in all member states and for the European Union institutions to remain on the same page and to proceed with what they have agreed on.
Well, in the same time, we see that various countries react differently. For instance, Bulgaria is willing to renegotiate with Russia in Vladimir Putin terms when it comes to using Russian gas. Hungary already has a new contract with Gazprom, and also in the same time, Hungary is also talking about not backing up anymore the military support for Ukraine. Is the idea that Ukraine is fighting for the greater good of all of us losing its meaning?
You asked a very important question, and you named the problem as well. Of course, Russia has 4 important trump cards to play. The first being the energy card, and there are still dependencies among the European Union member states. That means that right now, these dependencies are not equally dispersed, and some countries will be feeling more pain in the short term to diversify away from Russian supplies. The second important card is the food blackmail, basically amplifying the global food crisis, which also has ramifications for Europe. The third one being the fertilizers, and the fourth one, the nuclear blackmail. So right now, when it comes to the energy blackmail, it is very important also to understand that, of course, in one or other member states, there will be actors on the ground, political actors, who would seek to actually score bonus points for their own sake, while actually still playing the Russian card. But in the long term, this is no longer sustainable. So it is absolutely clear that we need to remain on the same page, and at the very same time, we should also expect that there will be further political crises in one or other member state, because these kind of actors will try to capitalize on the Russian energy card in the short term.
But besides these political actors you are talking about, we see that also at the level at the European, in important countries and in important institutions, scandals of spying for Russians are increasing. There are citizens working for high-level institutions of Germany, for instance, or even at the level of NATO, that are being caught spying for the Russians, European citizens. Is this another weakness of Europe? We need to improve the vetting process of those persons that are taking these jobs?
Absolutely. And let's be very clear that on the February 24th, Russia launched not only a full-scale war against a sovereign country, being Ukraine, but it also launched an information war and also commodities war against Europe. Because in this existential war, Moscow actually seeks also to win the information war against us, against the Europeans. And that means, of course, the European institutions and European member states. It will seek any weak spots, be it at the level of citizens, at the level of governments, but also at the level of institutions, to explore and exploit the weaknesses, to penetrate, of course, the political spectrum, and to also use these dependencies for the sake of its own Russian interests. And of course, the idea here is to represent the continent as one that is not coherent in its approach towards Russia, to explore different political actors, to explore different civilian groups, and also to use weak spots in the institutions. What is the final, the ultimate goal here? Well, it is pretty much similar to what was happening during the Cold War, and in fact I argue that on the 24th of February, the launch of the full-scale war against Ukraine, the launch of a commodities and information war against Europe, was also the manifestation of a beginning of a Cold War 2.0, while Russia was trying to trigger the systemic competition between China and the United States. And why am I saying this right now? It's important to understand that we are already in a similar scenario like during the Cold War, when this informational war has to be waged on both sides. We need to understand that everything is at stake: our democratic order, our liberal economic order, and our civilian society. And these are the measures that we need to take in, well, counterfighting exactly this kind of influence.
In the same time, since you mentioned China, we see a third type of war, and I will call it the economical war, because while Russia is fighting with the Ukrainians, and both military and disinformational level, China is winning, let's say, in a more quiet way the world. It's doing investments, it's granting loans, which are very hard to reimburse. Shall we witness any change of this way of reactions in case of China? Shall we see that China will use its military powers?
Absolutely. First and foremost, like I said, I think that one of the main goals, not the most important one, the most important goal remains still the complete subjugation of Ukraine. Second layer I already exposed is, of course, to turn the European continent, the European security order, into a disorder, into a concert of European powers, because then Russia will be able to play European powers against each other. And the third important layer is what you have just addressed, namely that by launching the war, Moscow sought to intensify the systemic competition between China and the United States. It actually triggered China's reaction to overtly support Russia in the full-scale war since February 24th. In fact, China was spreading all of the disinformation, all of the Russian narratives from day one, and this was happening via all official diplomatic channels. It has been supportive also of the Russian positions in all relevant international organizations, but also in regional organizations where the West is isolated. And last but not least, what you also mentioned, of course, is that in an interconnected world like the one we are living right now, it is the first situation where we have a global capitalist system. All countries are interconnected. Of course, war is being waged by all possible means, including geoeconomics, including all these economic warfare instruments that you mentioned. And here, China has a lot of leverage. And as we saw, following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, in fact, it resulted in the most severe military escalation in the Strait of Taiwan and in the South China Sea. And in reality, China once again overtly showed its true interests in the region and beyond. That means, of course, that in my view, there is no turning back. Now, there were two more congressional delegations going to Taiwan, and I anticipate that China will be further escalating ahead of the very important Congress of the Communist Party that is to take place in this autumn. And given the fact that we also will be witnessing a midterm election in United States, I argue that we will have a very tense period in the bilateral relations between China and the United States, which also means that the West can actually not rely on any Chinese support for its positions when it comes to the international isolation of Russia.
Xi Jinping is heading to its third mandate as the President of the Republic. Since he will ensure its power in a very strong way, will his attitude towards the rest of the world, not only United States but also towards Europe, will change in any way, will become harsher?
I anticipate actually a period in which the relations between the United States and China will become more tense. We will see more overt Chinese action on all arenas of competition, in all relevant socio-economic networks, global trade, global economy, supply chains, all these dependencies that you also mentioned along the Belt and Road Initiative. That means relations with third countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, but also the relations with Europe, given the fact that Europe is now pretty much coherent when it comes to supporting Ukraine and trying to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. I think that this kind of bifurcation, that means splitting of the system in two large parts, is going to further deepen, and there will be a kind of a tough either-or choice for a lot of relevant regional actors, including the European powers. Well, they have to position themselves strategically. They have to say that they are, in fact, siding with the United States, because otherwise we may also end up in a situation where the European continent will be split in two major blocks along the most important geopolitical interests of the regional actors. That means, of course, based on their approach to Russia, based on their approach to China, and also based on their alliance, how allied are they with the United States.
And do you think, since you know very well the European political leaders, do you think that they will be able to have a coherent consensus when it comes to a relationship with China?
Well, this is, of course, an open question mark. Here, once again, a lot of leadership is required because it's about the long-term perspective of the continent. Do we want our continent to become a geopolitical backyard of the international relations, with all the relevant actors basically penetrating the continent for the sake of their own interests? Or do we want actually to come up with a very strong and coherent position where we say we need strategic patience, we need to do anything possible to help Ukraine win the war, actually help prevent a new geopolitical bloc emerging on our continent, one between Russia, Belarus, and then the parts of Ukraine that will be under Russian control. If that happens, because if that happens, the European security order as we know it is going to be gone. That will mean that we need to restore, or we need to actually withdraw completely this security order. And as you see, hard power, war are back on the agenda for not just the global affairs, but also for the European relations. And once again, if our political decision makers are short-sighted and are really thinking only in terms of their short-term oriented political agendas, trying to score bonus points in the short run, that means, of course, that we will be exposed and we will be weakened if we allow this kind of cleavages and differences to emerge.
Since we are talking as well about United States, and you did say that there will be midterm elections this November, also we witness in the United States an increase of radical opinions at the level of politicians this time, not only at the level of the Americans. How will this have an impact over all of us, especially Europe, because United States is the main provider of security for all of us?
Let me first start with the clear statement that we need to be honest with ourselves here in Europe, all of us, the family of 27, and we have to finally admit that we have been free riding on the back of American hard power for the last 30 years. And more or less, we need now to take care of our own European defense capabilities to become this very strong European pillar within NATO. Why is this important? Because you mentioned the problem. Bifurcation of global system means also bifurcation or polarization at the level of citizens, at the level of society. So what you mentioned as a problem is something that we are observing everywhere in the West, but also beyond. That is the major, of course, societal phenomenon right now of extreme positions on the left and on the right. Once again, one would say history repeats or probably rhymes similarly as 100 years ago. And that means, of course, that this polarization could also create a scenario in which in 2 years from now, there will be a president in the United States who will not be very favorable of, let's say, international organizations and institutions, as we saw already in the past. And that means that we need also, as Europeans, to take care of such a scenario and provide also for our own strategic autonomy, in a sense, as I said, within the NATO family. That means strong European pillar within the NATO family, providing for strong multilateral institutions with a solid leadership in those areas where we are good. We are very good in the area of trade. We are very good in the area of standards. We are very good in the area of capacities in different domains. And this is something that is being cherished around the world. But without being perceived as a security player, without having the required hard power, no one in the world, and as we see, global power competition is now moving eastwards, with China and United States being at the epicenter of it, but also with China and India being the new major Asian giants competition in the Indo-Pacific. And if we want to be part of all these relevant constellations, we need hard power. And this hard power is something that we need to build up, given also the fact that now the war has moved also to Europe.
The final question is a very short one regarding Republic of Moldova. Will this country be direct attacked by the military of Russia?
It all depends on how successful Russia will be in this critical phase of the war. Right now we are in the middle of a counter-offensive by the Ukrainian forces. Everything can shift very quickly on the fronts right now in the south and in the east. But one thing is clear. Russian plans do not stop in the east and in the south of Ukraine. Russia still seeks the complete political, economic and societal subjugation of Ukraine. And if necessary, in one of the further stages of the war, Russia may also, of course, create political situation, political instability in Transnistria, using also its military footprint on the ground. So this is actually something that I would not exclude as a scenario, as I said, given how successful Russia may be in this critical phase, which is why we need also to prevent Russia from winning in this critical phase, because then the danger of freezing the the war in the south and in the east is very high, because, as you also mentioned, there are these strong political voices in favor of peace, namely that there is this strong conviction, in my view, a wrong one, that by offering the negotiation table to Putin, inviting him to one of these nice capitals, well, he would stop the war, which is disillusional. So, yes, there is such a scenario, there is such possibility that Transnistria, but also the breakaway republics in Georgia, may be used for further military escalation, but also political instability, because this also creates a situation for the governments, namely the government in Moldova and the government in Georgia. And as we know, the two countries also have membership perspective. The one is a candidate with a candidate status, the other with a membership perspective. So it is absolutely on the table. Final point, and that goes back to the previous question, how important it is right now to also work on this polarization, because we see similar polarization that you mentioned in the American society, also in our European societies. Right now, if we stick to the short-term political extremes, and if we look for short-term political answers to critical questions, the questions of war and peace, I think that no society will be served well. So societies need to also start questioning their governments and start requiring actually long-term sustainable solutions. I think this is the only way to get out of this, as the top European Union diplomat said, triple crisis, right? Food, energy, finances, against the background of a war.
Velina Tchakarova, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de Twitter. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și în reluare sâmbătă după miezul nopții. La revedere!